Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a close look at a really critical patient safety issue, accidental decannulation. This is what happens when a breathing tube, a patient's literal lifeline on a ventilator, gets dislodged. And as you'll see, it's an event that raises some pretty tough questions about care and responsibility. So let's start with the human side of this. Just imagine getting that phone call. The source material calls it one of the most heartbreaking calls a family can possibly receive. It's that moment of absolute shock, right? Where a story of recovery just turns into a tragedy in a split second. All right, let's really picture this scene to understand what's at stake. Think about a loved one who's already been through a major illness. They're in a care facility, they're stable, they're on a ventilator, but they're recovering. You truly believe that the worst is over. And then you get that call. The facility tells you their breathing tube dislodged. And because of that, they've either passed away from a cardiac arrest or suffered irreversible brain damage. The first question that has to be going through your mind is, how? How could something like this possibly happen? And this is where it all gets really complicated. Was this just some freak, unavoidable accident? Or was it a preventable failure? That's the huge question that families and eventually investigators have to grapple with. Okay, so the official medical term for this is accidental decannulation. A tracheostomy, or a trach tube, isn't just a simple tube in the mouth. It's surgically inserted directly into the windpipe. For a patient who can't breathe on their own, this tube isn't just a piece of equipment. It is their one and only connection to the oxygen that's keeping them alive. And this is where you see a huge disconnect. A facility might offer excuses, right? It was a freak accident, or the patient pulled it out. But the medical reality is, these tubes are specifically designed not to come out easily. They're inserted deep into the airway and then physically secured around a patient's neck. So when one does come out, it's often a massive red flag that a safety protocol somewhere has failed. So if they don't just pop out on their own, what actually causes this to happen? Well, let's look at some of the specific breakdowns in care that can lead to this kind of catastrophe. One of the biggest culprits here is something called a one-person turn. See, the proper way, the standard of care for turning a patient on a ventilator, is always a two-person job. You have one person to turn the patient's body, and a second person whose only job is to protect that ventilator tubing, to make sure it doesn't get pulled. When a single, rushed aide tries to do it all alone, that heavy tubing can get snagged and literally rip the breathing tube right out of the patient's throat. And then there's the trach tie itself. That's the little collar that holds the whole thing in place. There's a really strict protocol for this. It needs to be snug, but with just enough room for one finger to slip underneath. If those ties are left too loose, or if they get wet or frayed and aren't changed out, the entire breathing apparatus is compromised. It's that simple. So what about that common excuse, the patient pulled it out themselves? Well, here's the thing. The standard of care totally anticipates that risk. If a patient is known to be agitated or confused or suffering from delirium, the facility has a duty to put safety measures in place. Things like having someone watch them one-on-one or using safe hand mittens. So blaming the patient, that doesn't get the facility off the hook for its duty to keep them safe. But look, the tube coming out is often only the first mistake. What happens in the moments after the ventilator alarm starts screaming is just as critical, if not more so. This is what's known in the medical world as the failure to rescue. And the most crucial point here is the clock. It is ticking, and it's ticking fast. The second that tube is out, the patient is suffocating. Brain injury can start to set in after just 4 to 6 minutes. The response has to be instant, and it has to be correct. There is absolutely no time to figure things out. And this really gets to the heart of what's called secondary malpractice. The first error was the tube coming out. The second, and often fatal error, is the failure to respond correctly. A successful rescue is not about luck. It's about having staff who are trained for this exact emergency and having the right equipment ready to go right there at a moment's notice. The standard of care actually mandates this. Every single patient with a trach tube must have an emergency kit, sometimes called a go bag, right at their bedside. This is not optional. It's got to have backup tubes, an insertion guide, and a manual resuscitation bag, an ambu bag, so they can pump oxygen into the patient's lungs even if they can't get the tube back in right away. So, that leads to a really chilling question. What happens when a nurse or an aide runs to the bedside and that go bag isn't there? What if it's locked away in a supply closet down the hall? Every one of those precious seconds spent frantically searching for equipment is a second the patient's brain is being starved of oxygen. So when a tragedy like this happens, getting a straight story can be really, really tough. So how do investigators piece together the truth?
Well, they follow the evidence that can't be changed or hidden.
Because while people's stories can change and memories can get fuzzy, the machine itself keeps a perfect record. The ventilator is the one objective witness that cannot lie.
This is such a powerful way to think about it. The ventilator's internal computer is basically an airplane's black box. It logs everything. Every single breath, every tiny change in air pressure, and most importantly, every single alarm. The data can prove exactly when an alarm went off and how many minutes or even seconds passed before someone responded. And it's not just the ventilator. Other objective sources help build the full picture. You've got the EMS records, which show exactly what paramedics found when they arrived. And you have corporate staffing logs, which can prove whether a facility was chronically understaffed, forcing people to take dangerous shortcuts in the first place. And that all brings us to the final and most critical thought. When an event like an accidental decannulation happens, we have to ask a much bigger question. Is it truly a one-off, unpredictable accident? Or is it a predictable, horrifying symptom of a much larger problem? A system where understaffing and a failure to follow basic life-saving protocols make these tragedies not just possible, but in some cases almost inevitable.